So I tried to keep an eye out for news related to Cyberpunk 2077 since that cinematic trailer first dropped around 2013, I would say. And leading up to the launch of Cyberpunk, I decided I would even go ahead and spring for the special edition Xbox One X, and also the PlayStation 4 Super Fancy Collector's Edition. All of this is to say that I literally and metaphorically bought into the Cyberpunk pre-release hype in a significant way, pretty much lock, stock, and barrel, and I'll say that to this day, I have zero buyer's remorse about that decision. But that probably needs some additional context because, as we all know, the Cyberpunk 2077 launch was more than a little bit rocky. But here's the thing, at the time when all of those bugs were happening and glitches that were really plaguing, especially the PS4 version, I was largely shielded from a lot of that because I chose to play it on the Series X that I'd gotten just a couple of months prior. And after that first run through Cyberpunk's story, I largely forgot about it, just threw it back on the shelf, and moved on to other games that I was interested in at the time, particularly Demon's Souls for the PS5. But even though I beat Cyberpunk 2077, I hardly finished every last drop of what Night City had to offer, considering there are hundreds of hours of gameplay packed in here beyond the main questline. But what I really like about Cyberpunk is that it is an RPG first and a shooter second, in my personal opinion. Meaning that after I did roll credits for the first time, I made a decision that I would definitely return to at some point so I could see what other adventures I might embark on, considering you can make so many different choices for your version of V. And since it plays well on the Steam Deck, I figured this was probably the right time to give it another go. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, is what it's like returning to Cyberpunk 2077 almost 2 years later, and on the Steam Deck no less. And what I really wanted to go over today was, 1, how does it actually perform on the Steam Deck itself? 2, is Cyberpunk 2077 a little bit more stable than it was during the launch period? And then finally, what was it like for me personally just returning to that world and exploring it with my particular version of V? So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, naturally, as is the case with most games in this genre, there is an inherent awe factor jumping into a world that's this expansive on the deck, and Night City is no exception. And something I really like about Cyberpunk's world is that it feels a lot more densely packed than other AAA open worlds, featuring a lot of verticality and interesting routes through the city that snake above, under, and through its various districts and mega buildings. Which is to say, when you're driving or running through its streets, it never really feels like you're just on a large flat plane. And while you can't go into every door you see or anything, there are still a lot of interesting interior environments that you can explore, which really make it feel layered and packed with interesting things to stumble across at any given moment. And all of this holds up reasonably well on the Steam Deck. Now, with this sort of graphical fidelity, you're not going to get like a 60 FPS experience or anything, but using the default profile that they included directly in the menu for the Steam Deck keeps a steady 30 FPS most of the time, with occasional dips into the high 20s. I feel like a weatherman when I say stuff like that. But for the majority of the time that I've spent diving back in so far, it stayed at, or at least very close to 30 FPS, which is completely playable. I did try to tinker with the settings a bit and see if I could get to that 40Hz sweet spot, but even after cranking down the settings, it seemed to fluctuate so much that I ended up just setting it back to the default profile. Now, personally, I don't need the greatest graphical fidelity in my gaming or anything, but a consistent or near consistent frame rate is definitely ideal. And at least some of that is thanks to having played most of The Witcher 3 on the Switch, which really drove home the point that I don't need perfect quality to enjoy a game of this scope in a handheld setting. And just like a couple of weeks ago when I was testing out Spider-Man, it seems like the default Steam Deck graphics profile really does strike a good middle ground between clarity and performance. And speaking of performance, if you're playing portably on the deck using just battery power and using this graphics configuration, I kind of figured that I would get about an hour and a half worth of play out of Cyberpunk. So I started a stopwatch, and sure enough, it was just about 90 minutes whenever I got the low battery warning and was about to run dry, which, again, I kind of figured would be the case after seeing similar playtimes in games like Horizon Zero Dawn or Days Gone. So if you're looking to play Cyberpunk in portable mode for hours at a time, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're near an outlet, or at least you've got like a beefy backup battery to make sure you can keep the party going. Now, to be fair, I wasn't very concerned with how the graphics would appear on the Steam Deck or what kind of battery longevity that I was going to get, but what I was worried about was how Cyberpunk would perform as a whole. Again, I played this originally on the Series X and was largely shielded from most of the issues that plagued that system's launch, and the Series X is certainly more powerful than the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, and considering the Steam Deck is closer in power to those systems, I was a little bit concerned about how well it would do even after a couple of years of patching at this point. But I'm happy to report that it was mostly a flawless experience. I didn't encounter any of the quest-breaking issues that happened in the beginning of Cyberpunk's launch, and the visuals remained mostly smooth as I worked through the opening hours. However, I did hit one or two weird issues. One was right in the middle of a mission where I accidentally clipped into what I think was a barrel I'd taken cover behind and got stuck in the geometry, which basically forced me to reload my checkpoint, but thankfully it didn't put me back to the beginning of the mission or anything. And graphically, the only weirdness I encountered was after my first brain dance sequence, where it seemed like every light source in the environment was flickering, but it cleared up after a couple of minutes, and I couldn't remember if maybe it was supposed to do that, considering again, I did just go through a brain dance sequence, and I would imagine that process would leave anybody a little hazy and disoriented. But beyond those two minor issues during my first 5 hours of play, I really didn't encounter anything else that you would call significant. I didn't have any, UI weirdness, I didn't have any quest break on me, I wasn't booted back to the menu or anything like that, and I definitely didn't encounter any nude T-posing, so I will take that as a win. So the Steam Deck performance was solid, the game itself remained very playable, but did I actually have a good time jumping back into Cyberpunk after a nearly 2-year absence? I would say yes. For starters, I went Corpo this time instead of Street Kid for my life path, and I think I might have liked its intro a little bit better. Or at the very least, I liked having more familiarity with that rung of Night City society whenever I was presented with dialogue options for the opening story beats. And I think that really speaks to the fact that Cyberpunk really is more of an RPG than a shooter, or at least it is as much an RPG as it is a shooter. I mean, don't get me wrong, you'll definitely be blasting stuff and navigating dialogue branches in fairly equal measure, but it just really does feel like I can step into the role of my customized V and flesh out that story in a way that at least feels sort of distinct. Granted, there are only so many paths in this choose-your-own-adventure sort of design, so you'll still end up connecting with Jackie and kicking off your adventure proper with the same montage and end up in the same apartment and everything. But it did make me stop to think more about this new version of V as I engaged in conversations with other characters. For instance, would I make her more likely to go along with her friends' recommendations, or would I really embody the headstrong corporate history that was now part of the headcanon that I'd crafted for my version of V? And this aspect of the game is probably my favorite just because it's clear so much thought went into crafting not just rich characters and interesting side quests, which you can kind of expect from CDPR at this point, but also ensuring that the world itself feels fleshed out, with Night City having its own unique hierarchy, quirks, norms, and lexicon. I seriously never get sick of Jackie or other characters calling me Choom or hearing Eurodollars shorthanded as Eddies. And on the combat side of things, Cyberpunk felt just as good as I remembered. Of course, you don't have to just shoot things, as you can go for more melee-focused builds, or lean more heavily into the cerebral with a Netrunner build, which, honestly, that probably would have been pretty fun to explore, but I also know at a certain point that can make you almost game-breakingly powerful. So with that in mind, I opted to go for the more traditional run-and-gun style of combat, with occasional breaks for stealth that I would inevitably screw up and then end up back in run-and-gun combat. Which I realize is kind of a vanilla build, but it's still fun because there's just such a wide variety of firearms at your disposal, from standard pistols and shotguns to smart armaments with enhanced abilities. And enemies have a lot of tricks up their sleeves to keep encounters interesting, even if they're not the smartest AI I've ever encountered in a game. The only real problem that I have with Cyberpunk as a whole is from a design standpoint where the worlds of combat and story/RPG overlap. Most of the time it does a good job making sure you can still focus on an incoming call or a message while you're stuck in combat, but every now and then I feel like I'm missing some bit of story by accident. Plus, with the massive amount of items that you can find strewn about, occasionally it can feel like the pacing's taking a hit, especially if I have to make a major character wait on me before we can progress because I'm too busy looting a dozen fresh bodies of their belongings, many of which I probably won't even use and I'll just end up scrapping for crafting components. So yeah, in a nutshell, I would say Cyberpunk plays pretty great on the Steam Deck. My only hesitation about playing this one over other open world titles is that in portable mode, you're likely to spend a whole lot more time talking than just jumping into the action. Now, if you appreciate these role-playing elements as much as blasting up a bunch of Maelstrom goons, then this won't be a point of concern. But considering some of the pre-mission dialogue can take 10 to 15 minutes when you've only got about 90 minutes of battery life in a pick-up-and-play situation, there are definitely other open world options on the deck that are better suited to just giving you a quick hit of blow-stuff-up action if that's really what you're after. But still, if you've never played Cyberpunk before, it's definitely worth checking out. Now, are there better ways that you can check it out? Yeah, if you have access to a beefy gaming rig or a PS5 or a Series X, it might make sense to jump in there just so you can really see the visual glory of Night City come alive with a 60 FPS experience and all that. So maybe if you have the Steam Deck, the best case scenario would be to use its cloud save functionality whenever you just want, a quick hit of some Cyberpunk action in between longer sessions on a gaming rig. But still, if this is your only way to play Cyberpunk, it's still going to be a good experience, and I still think it would be worth a look. But hey, what about you? Are you going to be jumping into Cyberpunk for the first time on the Steam Deck? Or is it a situation like me where you've played and beaten it before, but you just want to jump in for another go and really see how your character would evolve differently on a second playthrough? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch these videos. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.